By the end of the 19th century, the United States was no longer a young nation searching for its identity. It had become a machine of wealth production, operating at a pace unprecedented in human history. Railroads cut across the continent. Factories rose densely along rivers darkened by coal smoke. Newly rich families emerged so quickly that many of them barely understood which social class they had entered. This was the era later known as the Gilded Age, an age both dazzling and deeply ironic, for the gold covered only the surface, while beneath it lay profound instability in identity, power, and the desire for recognition. Within this landscape, America's wealthy began to realize a difficult truth. Money, no matter how vast, was not enough to purchase what they desired most: social legitimacy. In Europe, power had been inherited over centuries, fixed in stone, heraldry, and estates that had outlived human memory itself. In America, everything was new, and that newness, rather than a source of pride, became a quiet anxiety among a young and untested upper class. From that anxiety emerged a distinct architectural movement. Along the eastern seaboard, enormous estates began to rise not as homes meant simply to be lived in, but as declarations carved in stone. They borrowed the language of French chateaux, English country houses, and European classical traditions, all in service of a single purpose: to prove that Americans, too, could possess history, even if that history had to be artificially constructed. Amid this wave, on a quiet stretch of land in New York State, a structure appeared whose ambition far exceeded the ordinary function of a private residence. Its name was Halcyon Hall. From its very name, Halcyon Hall evoked an ideal. In classical tradition, Halcyon referred to days of perfect calm, a flawless stillness amid the chaos of the world. Yet ironically, this estate was born not from peace, but from a deeply rooted unease: the fear that American wealth would always be regarded as crude, shallow, and forever inferior to the old aristocracies of Europe. The man behind Halcyon Hall was neither a king nor the descendant of an ancient dynasty. He was a representative figure of America's financial elite, shaped by commerce, driven by conquest, and convinced that anything could be created with enough money, time, and determination. To him, Halcyon Hall was not merely a place to live. It was a cultural project, an attempt to carve his name into the flow of history through limestone walls, soaring ceilings, and grand halls meant to echo with the footsteps of an imagined past. The estate was designed to overwhelm from the very first glance. Its monumental facade followed strict symmetry, its architectural details recalling 18th-century English estates. Inside, imported materials, finely carved woodwork, and carefully orchestrated spaces served not simply to function, but to be seen. Every room told a story of power, control, and the longing to stand shoulder to shoulder with the ancient families across the Atlantic. Yet, like so many symbols of the Gilded Age, Halcyon Hall contained an irresolvable contradiction. It was built to appear timeless, yet it existed within a society changing at extraordinary speed. The values it sought to emulate, stability, inheritance, rigid social order, were not truly American. And it was precisely this misalignment that planted the seeds of the quiet tragedy the estate would face in the decades to come. At the moment of its completion, Halcyon Hall stood as a triumph, a dream made solid. But history rarely pauses at the moment of victory. And soon, questions began to surface. Who would sustain this legacy? Who would inhabit halls too vast for modern life? And could an aristocratic dream, built on industrial wealth, survive once society itself began turning away from symbols of privilege? At the time, these questions had no answers. but they were already present, embedded silently in every stone of Halcyon Hall, waiting for the day history would speak. Every great estate carries the imprint of a single individual, even when that hand tries to hide behind layers of stone, wood, and endless corridors. At Halcyon Hall, that individual was not a loud figure splashed across newspaper headlines, but a representative product of a new American generation at the end of the 19th century. A generation not born into castles, yet convinced it could build them. Not inheritors of aristocratic bloodlines, yet certain that social rank could be manufactured through architecture, ritual, and the repetition of power. He emerged from the world of business, where time was measured in profit margins and human worth was closely tied to expansion. His career took shape during America's industrial explosion, when bold individuals could accumulate in a single lifetime what had taken centuries in Europe. But that speed came at a psychological cost. Wealth arrived too quickly. Status followed too abruptly. And American society had not yet developed the ceremonies required to transform money into lasting legitimacy. In private life, he was disciplined, reserved, and acutely aware of how he was perceived. Social gatherings, invitations, dinners, and handshakes were never casual. They were strategic. He understood that in elite society, being invited mattered almost as much as possessing wealth. Halcyon Hall, in his mind, was meant to become a permanent invitation, one that would secure his family a place within a social order America itself was still struggling to define. The construction of the estate unfolded over several years, not only because of its scale, but because of its obsessive attention to detail. Every element was carefully chosen to avoid even the slightest trace of new money. Architectural references were drawn from Europe, yet subtly altered to fit the American landscape. This was not a replica, but an interpretation, an effort to create the illusion that the building had always been there, that it was not the product of commerce, but the inevitable outcome of history itself. And yet, within this pursuit of permanence, a contradiction quietly formed. Halcyon Hall was built to project stability, but its owner lived in a world defined by volatility. Markets shifted, industries rose and fell, and the social codes he tried so carefully to adopt were themselves unstable. Old American families viewed these new estates with suspicion, while a growing working class increasingly saw them as symbols of widening inequality. In the early summers after its completion, the estate fulfilled its intended purpose. Lavish gatherings filled the grand halls beneath heavy chandeliers. Guests moved through vast rooms not only to dine, but to be seen and to acknowledge one another's place within a carefully staged hierarchy. Everything was arranged to suggest order, permanence, and control. But beyond the stone walls, America was changing faster than anyone expected. The next generation no longer admired European grandeur with the same reverence. American pragmatism began to assert itself, questioning the necessity of oversized spaces built for display rather than daily life. New values, efficiency, flexibility, adaptability began to challenge the aristocratic ideal Halcyon Hall represented. The owner sensed this shift, though he never publicly acknowledged it. In his later years, he retreated into more private spaces, hosted fewer gatherings, and gradually recognized that the structure he had built to anchor his family in history had become too large for the society forming around it. Halcyon Hall, once a declaration, was becoming a quiet burden. When he died, the question was no longer what the estate represented, but who would carry it forward. The next generation inherited not only a monumental property, but a dream already losing the support of its time. And from that moment, Halcyon Hall entered a new chapter, no longer a story of ambition fulfilled, but one of maintenance, erosion, and unavoidable choice. After the death of its original owner, Halcyon Hall did not collapse overnight. It remained standing solid, silent, as if time itself had not yet noticed that the spiritual center of the estate had vanished. But the fate of great estates is rarely decided by stone and mortar. It is decided by people. And here, a generational shift opened a void that no architecture could fill. The heirs entered Halcyon Hall with a fundamentally different relationship to it than their predecessor. For them, the estate was not a dream realized, but a reality inherited, a massive responsibility passed down without the absolute belief that had once sustained it. They came of age in a different America, one in which social values had begun to shift, where aristocracy was no longer an aspiration, but an increasingly distant, even questionable idea. The cost of maintaining an estate like Halcyon Hall had never been modest, but in the early decades of the 20th century, it became a genuine burden. Heating systems, staff wages, constant repairs, rising property taxes, all of it had been designed for a social model in which such expenses required little thought. As the American economy entered more unstable cycles, and family fortunes no longer expanded as effortlessly as before, the estate's extravagance began to reveal its underside. More importantly, Halcyon Hall no longer aligned with the way people lived. Its vast rooms, seldom used grand halls, and spaces designed to impress rather than to inhabit created an atmosphere not of luxury, but of emptiness. Not because the house lacked people, but because it lacked purpose. An estate can endure for centuries if it continues to be lived in. But once it is merely preserved, decline has already begun, even if no one dares to name it. At the same time, American society was undergoing profound transformation. Progressive movements, the rise of the middle class, and a series of economic shocks began to erode public faith in symbols of inherited privilege. Large estates increasingly came to be seen not as cultural achievements, but as relics of inequality. What once conveyed prestige now produced distance. And Halcyon Hall, though silent, was not immune to this shift. The heirs faced choices with no neutral outcome. To keep the estate meant accepting a way of life increasingly disconnected from modern society. To sell it meant acknowledging that the previous generation's dream could not be sustained. Every option carried loss, not only financial loss, but loss of meaning. For many years, Halcyon Hall existed in a state of suspension. It was no longer a social center, yet not fully abandoned. It was used sparingly, opened occasionally for limited gatherings, then left to long stretches of silence. That suspension proved more dangerous than any dramatic event. Architecture built to symbolize permanence rarely survives ambiguity. Subtle signs of decline began to appear. Not dramatic cracks, but small details, doors repaired less frequently, gardens no longer maintained to their former standard, ceremonial spaces rendered unnecessary. Each detail reflected the same truth: the estate was losing its place in lived society. By the mid-20th century, Halcyon Hall's story was no longer about ambition, but about failed adaptation. America had entered a new era, one that valued speed, flexibility, and efficiency. In that world, buildings like Halcyon Hall were no longer measured by beauty or grandeur, but by practical viability. And by that standard, the aristocratic dream on American soil was visibly beginning to unravel. Yet the story was not over. When a symbol loses its original function, it is often passed into different hands, for different purposes. And it was precisely this transfer that would push Halcyon Hall into its darkest chapter, where ideals gave way to calculation, and silence began to take on an entirely new meaning. When an estate can no longer sustain the dream that created it, history rarely concludes with a dramatic collapse. More often, it proceeds through quiet transfer. Halcyon Hall entered this phase not with public spectacle, but through pragmatic decisions made in boardrooms, legal documents, and under the growing pressure of numbers that were becoming increasingly difficult to justify. For the heirs, finding a new function for the estate was not an act of creativity, but one of survival. The grand halls, once designed to host elite society, were now evaluated by entirely different criteria: how many people they could hold, how much they would cost to operate, and whether they could generate reliable income. By the 20th century, America had grown accustomed to repurposing old symbols for new uses, and Halcyon Hall was no exception. Proposals emerged one after another. At various points, the property was considered as a private educational institution where its vast spaces might suit a boarding model. At other times, it was envisioned as a care facility or a community organization. Each proposal required changes that could not be avoided. Walls were added, layouts altered, and ceremonial spaces stripped of their original meaning to accommodate practical needs. It was in these alterations that the fragility of the American aristocratic dream became fully visible. Halcyon Hall had not been built to adapt. It had been built to remain still in a moving world. When forced to change, the estate responded like an aging body, enduring, but never fully recovering. Each adjustment represented a loss, not only of material integrity, but of symbolic coherence. At the same time, society's perception of such estates continued to shift. By the mid-20th century, large Gilded Age properties were no longer widely admired as achievements. Instead, they were increasingly seen as remnants of an outdated social order. In an era shaped by economic hardship, global war, and rising egalitarian ideals, estates like Halcyon Hall came to feel distant and misaligned with collective values. The repurposing of the estate, therefore, was not merely a financial solution. It was a symbolic concession. As spaces were divided and functions replaced form, Halcyon Hall gradually lost the ability to tell its original story. Later occupants no longer encountered an American attempt at aristocracy, but a vast, complicated structure detached from its historical intent. Yet these transformations failed to provide lasting stability. Each new use faced inherent limitations. Maintenance costs remained high, while the symbolic value that once justified the estate's existence had faded. Halcyon Hall entered a familiar cycle shared by many Gilded Age properties rescued from abandonment in the short term, but never secured for the long term. Over time, decisions became increasingly driven by reduction. Underused areas were closed permanently. Peripheral spaces fell into neglect. What had once been a unified architectural statement began to function as a collection of disconnected zones. And in that fragmentation, the estate lost the most essential element of all, the sense that it possessed a shared purpose. By the end of this transitional phase, Halcyon Hall was no longer the symbol of a family, nor had it become a new symbol for the public. It existed in an in-between state, where physical presence remained, but historical meaning had been eroded. This, more than any single event, placed the estate in its most vulnerable position. For when a place is no longer clearly understood, it becomes far easier to treat it as a burden rather than a legacy. And from this unresolved condition, another turning point awaited, one in which cultural value would no longer be enough to protect the estate, and more pragmatic forces would begin to determine its fate. There comes a moment in the life of great estates when they no longer provoke debate, nor inspire protection. They are simply overlooked. For Halcyon Hall, that moment arrived not through a single decisive act, but through the accumulated fatigue of decades fatigue from mounting costs, from inherited responsibility, and from the constant need to justify why a structure built for an earlier world should continue to exist in a society that had moved on. As proposed uses failed one by one, or became impractical, the estate entered its most dangerous phase, existence without a clear purpose. No longer a social center, yet not officially recognized as a protected historic site, the property drifted into a gray zone of history. And it was within that gray zone that opportunistic decisions began to surface. Developers no longer looked at Halcyon Hall as a story, but as a calculation. Square footage, location, structural potential. But for that equation to make sense, history had to be simplified. Architectural details that did not serve a new function were deemed expendable. Symbolic spaces that resisted conversion became liabilities. And slowly, a process of optimization began, incremental, rational, and irreversible. This transformation rarely shocked observers at first. There was no single day when one could point and say the estate had lost its soul. Instead, it was the accumulation of small, seemingly reasonable choices. A wing permanently closed, decorative elements removed to reduce maintenance costs, a garden left unrestored after winter. Each decision made sense in isolation. Together, they formed a steady erosion. During this period, Halcyon Hall began to fade from collective memory. It no longer appeared in accounts celebrating Gilded Age opulence, nor did it stand out enough to become a cautionary monument. It existed between those narratives, where silence became its defining feature. New generations grew up unaware of its original meaning. To them, it was simply an old, confusing structure, one that felt disconnected from contemporary life. This loss of connection created the greatest vulnerability of all, the loss of narrative ownership. When no one remains who fully understands or cares to defend a site's historical context, it becomes easy to redefine it in reductive terms. Labels such as outdated, inefficient, or obstructive to progress take hold. Once accepted, those labels justify far more aggressive actions. Across the United States, many Gilded Age estates met their end in precisely this way. Some were demolished to make room for new development. Others were stripped down until only a hollow shell remained, their defining features erased. Halcyon Hall stood at the same crossroads for many years, with little indication that it would escape a similar fate. Yet history rarely moves in straight lines. At times, the moment of greatest vulnerability becomes the final opportunity for change. As the estate approached the edge of disappearance, it began to attract a different kind of attention, not admiration, but concern. And from that concern emerged a new question: would allowing Halcyon Hall to vanish truly be a solution, or would it represent an irreversible loss to historical memory? That question did not produce an immediate answer. But it marked the arrival of a new force in the story: individuals who viewed the estate not through profit, but through memory and responsibility. And it was they who would push Halcyon Hall into its next chapter, where the past would confront the present in a fragile attempt to preserve what remained. When a structure reaches the edge of disappearance, history rarely responds with consensus. It responds with conflict. For Halcyon Hall, that moment arrived when proposals of permanent consequence were first placed in the open. No longer minor adjustments or quiet neglect, these were plans capable of erasing, once and for all, the physical trace of a dream that had once embodied an entire era. Development proposals appeared in the familiar language of the 20th century: land efficiency, economic return, contemporary community needs. In reports and assessments, the estate was described more through figures than through meaning: how many acres, how much maintenance cost, and how much profit the land might generate if cleared. Within these calculations, history was compressed into a secondary factor, a variable open to negotiation. It was at this moment that a small group of preservation-minded voices began to emerge. They were not always powerful figures. Sometimes they were local historians, sometimes architects, sometimes residents who had lived long enough to understand that losing a place like this meant more than losing a building. They saw in Halcyon Hall not outdated luxury, but a rare material record of how America once attempted to define itself. The debate quickly extended beyond the fate of a single property. It became a broader question about how society should treat legacies bound up with inequality and privilege. Should symbols of a former social order be preserved, or allowed to disappear as a way of closing the past? Advocates of development argued that maintaining a costly structure purely for remembrance was impractical. Preservationists countered that demolition would erase the opportunity to learn from the contradictions embedded in history. In public hearings and planning meetings, Halcyon Hall became a focal point for competing emotions. Some saw it as a burden. Others saw it as an obligation. Notably, very few still saw it as a dream. The era had moved on, and with it, the way people connected to the past. Preservation in this context was no longer about freezing a site in time, but about deciding which parts of history were worth carrying forward. Efforts to save the estate came late and under pressure. Proposals to designate it as a historic landmark surfaced only after significant deterioration had already occurred. Restoration plans collided with harsh financial realities. Every stone requiring repair, every detail needing reconstruction, raised the same question: at what cost and for what return? In modern society, where public resources are always contested, history rarely wins without compromise. In the end, no side achieved a clear victory. Halcyon Hall was not entirely erased, but neither was it restored to its former prominence. It survived in a negotiated form, preserved enough to avoid oblivion, yet constrained enough to limit its burden. This outcome mirrored the fate of many Gilded Age estates: survival without restoration of original purpose, existence without former authority. What mattered most, however, was how the estate's story was retold after this confrontation. No longer a narrative of wealth or personal ambition, it became a lesson in the limits of financial power when confronted with time and social change. Halcyon Hall stood as a reminder that not everything built to last can succeed in doing so. In this fragile state of survival, the estate's final meaning came into focus. It no longer represented the American aristocratic dream, but the dissolution of that dream, itself a stone record of how a society that once borrowed Europe's image ultimately confronted its own nature: restless, adaptive, and unwilling to anchor its future to the symbols of the past. When the debates finally subsided, when agreements were signed and compromises became reality, Halcyon Hall entered the final phase of its historical life cycle. It did not emerge as a symbol of victory, nor did it vanish into complete ruin. Instead, it settled into a quiet existence layered with memory, a fate rarely imagined by those who built monuments meant to last forever, yet common among dreams that outlive their time. Viewed from historical distance, Halcyon Hall is no longer the story of a single family or a solitary architectural decision. It stands as a representative case of America's attempt to manufacture aristocracy through material form, ceremony, and borrowed symbolism. The estate embodied the belief that history could be constructed quickly, that stone and space could substitute for time and inheritance. But the life cycle of the building itself ultimately exposed the limits of that belief. The American aristocratic dream, did not collapse in a dramatic moment. It dissolved slowly across generations through gradual changes in how people lived, worked, and defined value. As American society moved away from reverence for display toward admiration for adaptability, estates like Halcyon Hall lost the social foundation that once supported them. They no longer answered the most basic architectural question: why must this exist in this form? Yet this dissolution did not render the estate meaningless. On the contrary, its failure proved more instructive than success ever could have been. In its compromised survival, Halcyon Hall became a material record of a moment when America longed to appear ancient rather than dynamic, established rather than evolving. It demonstrated that not all values can be imported, and that symbols detached from their social context rarely endure. In the 21st century, those who pass through what remains of the estate no longer experience awe. Instead, they encounter something quieter: a recognition that this place was built for a world that no longer exists. The walls still carry traces of ambition, anxiety, and the conviction that architecture could secure social permanence against time. It is precisely this tension that gives the site its lasting relevance. Seen more broadly, Halcyon Hall reflects a recurring pattern in American history: the constant negotiation between past and present, between inheritance and reinvention. The United States neither fully erases the remnants of its aristocratic experiments nor allows them to dictate the future. Instead, such places are retained as points of reflection rather than models to follow. And perhaps that is Halcyon Hall's final and most honest legacy. It is not a monument to enduring power, but a quiet reminder that power cannot be fixed in form. It shows that America, despite its moments of imitation, ultimately defines itself through movement rather than permanence. In acknowledging the limits of borrowed grandeur, the nation reveals a deeper maturity. When the history of Halcyon Hall seems complete, when the aristocratic dream has been examined, unraveled, and placed within its proper historical frame, what remains is not a conclusion, but a pause. And it is within that pause that history continues to exist. Today, Halcyon Hall no longer occupies a central place in any social ambition. It is no longer being expanded, nor entirely erased. Like many remnants of the Gilded Age, it stands not as a vision of the future, but as evidence of a moment when America stood between two conflicting desires: to become modern, and yet to appear ancient. Those who enter what remains of the estate today rarely feel overwhelmed. Instead, they experience something harder to define: a sense that this place was built for a different world, shaped by different expectations and different fears. The walls no longer speak loudly, but neither are they silent. They hold layered traces of time, where each generation has left behind its own understanding of power and value. In this sense, Halcyon Hall did not fail. It simply did not become what its creator intended. And in history, that distinction matters. Many of the most meaningful legacies are not those that fulfilled their original purpose, but those that allow later generations to see how social thinking evolves in concrete, physical ways. The story of Halcyon Hall also reminds us that America does not build its identity by extending the past indefinitely, but by continually renegotiating its relationship with it. What no longer fits is repurposed, reduced, or pushed to the margins. Rarely does it disappear entirely. Instead, it survives in altered form, becoming a quiet foundation beneath the present. If Halcyon Hall leaves behind any lasting insight, it is not a lesson in luxury, nor merely a warning about inequality. It is proof of the limits of ambition when it seeks to outrun time without changing alongside it. In a modern world where survival depends on adaptation, structures created to stand still often pay the highest price. And so, Halcyon Hall does not need to be remembered as a tragedy, nor celebrated as a triumph. It deserves to be understood as a long paragraph in the history of the United States, one that shows identity cannot be built on form alone, and that no architecture is strong enough to preserve meaning. Once society has redefined power, after the story ends, Halcyon Hall remains. It does not demand attention. It does not insist on preservation at all costs. It simply exists as a quiet reminder that history never truly concludes. It only steps back, waiting for someone willing to listen. At a certain point in American history, estates like Halcyon Hall ceased to belong to those who built them. Not because they were seized, and not because they were destroyed, but because their social meaning moved on. When that shift occurs, architecture does not collapse overnight. It simply becomes isolated. Halcyon Hall was born from the belief that power could be fixed in space. That if a family lived long enough within rooms grand enough, formal enough, and visibly European enough, time itself would eventually accept them as part of a permanent order. But the United States never operated by that logic. It is a society where status is not guaranteed by the past, but constantly tested by the present. What ultimately rendered Halcyon Hall obsolete was not physical decay, but a change in how Americans understood success. When power no longer required monumental architecture to validate it, when influence detached itself from land and lineage, spaces built to display inheritance began to lose their direction. They were not rejected with outrage. They simply became unnecessary. In the modern world, where movement outpaces preservation, places like Halcyon Hall exist as slow objects within a fast current. They cannot keep up with contemporary life, yet they do not vanish quickly enough to become pure memory. That condition turns them into open questions rather than settled answers. And it is precisely here that Halcyon Hall finds its final role. Not as a symbol of wealth, but as evidence of a failed cultural experiment, an experiment in which America briefly attempted to create a classical aristocracy, only to abandon the model by continuing to change. The remaining walls no longer speak of triumph. They speak of limits, the limits of money when measured against time. The limits of architecture when it tries to impose fixed meaning on a society defined by motion. And the limits of ambition when it refuses to accept that future generations may no longer need what was once considered essential. As the camera pulls away from Halcyon Hall, what lingers is not regret for a structure that lost its purpose, but the recognition that America matures precisely because it refuses to be bound by permanent symbols. The nation does not build its identity by preserving every old dream, but by allowing some of them to dissolve when they no longer serve the present. Halcyon Hall, therefore, is not a monument to failure. It is a marker of transition. It represents the moment when America stopped trying to imitate Europe through form, and instead accepted its own unstable nature, a society without eternal castles, but with an enduring capacity to redefine itself. In the final silence, the estate no longer belongs to aristocracy, nor to the family that built it. It belongs to history, not the history of glory, but of awakening. A reminder that sometimes the most important legacy a structure leaves behind is not what it became, but what society learned when it chose to move beyond it. At this final moment, there is nothing left to debate, and nothing left to rescue. The story of Halcyon Hall, in the end, does not demand a verdict. It only asks to be seen clearly as an honest cross-section of American history at a moment when the nation was still trying to understand itself. The great estates of the Gilded Age were built on the belief that time could be frozen through architecture. That if a structure were large enough, formal enough, and visibly European enough, society would be compelled to recognize a new social order as if it had always existed. But history does not operate according to form. It moves according to shifting values. Halcyon Hall was not defeated by poverty, nor erased by social resentment. It was simply left behind by an America that no longer required fixed symbols to confirm its identity. When success came to be measured by adaptability rather than inheritance, buildings designed to stand still fell out of rhythm with the world around them. And in that loss of rhythm, history reveals its quiet fairness. No structure is guaranteed survival simply because it was expensive. No dream is protected forever simply because it was once believed in completely. Time does not destroy everything through violence. It moves forward and leaves behind what can no longer keep pace. If Halcyon Hall retains meaning today, it is not because of its beauty or scale, but because of its reflective power. It reflects a moment when America tried on an identity that did not quite fit. A moment when the nation believed it could purchase history, rather than accept that history must be lived with, argued with, and sometimes released. In the end, Halcyon Hall does not need to be saved in order to matter. It matters precisely because it was not saved in the way its creators imagined. It shows that American identity is not built on permanent symbols, but on the willingness to change even when change requires letting go. As the final image fades, and the estate becomes nothing more than a silent presence within the modern landscape, history no longer whispers about excess or decline. It offers a quieter truth. Not every dream is meant to endure forever, and it is precisely that impermanence that allows society to move forward. At the place where the story stops, Halcyon Hall no longer asks to be remembered as a monument. It exists as proof that when history no longer needs protection through wealth or power, it will find its place in silence. And in that silence, America continues on. When the film ends, when the music fades, and when the name Halcyon Hall no longer appears on the screen, its story has not truly concluded. History does not exist to be watched. It exists to persist even when no one is actively looking for it. Like many structures born from the ambitions of the Gilded Age, Halcyon Hall no longer requires a narrator to justify its presence. That work was completed long ago. What remains now is not spectacle, but trace. The trace of a moment when people believed power could be made permanent. The trace of a society that once assumed size, form, and grandeur could compel time itself to stand still. But time never stands still. If someone were to pass Halcyon Hall today, without knowing its history, they would feel no sense of loss. And that fact speaks louder than any tragedy. Symbols created to overwhelm eventually become part of the background of ordinary life. They no longer demand admiration. They no longer insist on mourning, and perhaps that is the most honest state of legacy. Halcyon Hall does not need to be remembered as a mistake, nor preserved as a relic. It exists as evidence that societies retain only what can still speak to the present. Everything else, no matter how important it once seemed, gradually withdraws into silence not through rejection, but through irrelevance. Within that silence, history does not disappear. It simply changes position. It moves from the center of attention to a deeper layer beneath the present. Those who slow down enough, who remain curious enough, may still sense it not through awe, but through understanding how power, wealth, and time truly operate. Halcyon Hall offers no clear moral. It leaves behind an open question. In a society always moving forward, what is worth carrying with us, and what must be released in order to continue? There is no universal answer. Only choices, repeated generation after generation. When no one is watching, when no one is telling the story anymore, Halcyon Hall still stands not as a symbol, but as a witness, a silent witness proving that history does not require protection through wealth or authority to survive. It requires only time. And time, in the end, always chooses how the story is told. History does not exist only in what has already happened. It exists in how people today choose to remember, preserve, or move past the traces of what came before. After all its transformations, Halcyon Hall is no longer a closed story. It has become part of the present, though in a quiet, almost imperceptible way. Each generation that passes by the estate brings its own questions. No longer questions of power or wealth, but questions of value. Does a place like this still matter? Is a memory like this still worth maintaining? And when the answers are no longer clear, how does a society decide what comes next? Halcyon Hall does not ask to answer those questions on behalf of everyone. It exists simply as a point of reference where such questions can be asked. In a world where nearly everything is designed to be replaced quickly, the continued presence of a structure stripped of its original purpose becomes a statement in itself. Sometimes, remaining is already a form of dialogue with time. In the present tense, Halcyon Hall does not represent past glory, nor does it stand as a direct warning. It resembles a space between layers of time, a place where the present is forced to acknowledge that it is built upon earlier choices. In that acknowledgement, history ceases to feel like a burden. It becomes a foundation. One day, Halcyon Hall may disappear entirely. It may be replaced, erased, or survive only in archival records. But even if that day comes, the story will have already fulfilled its most important function. It will have shown that societies are shaped not only by what they preserve, but also by what they consciously allow to fade. The final chapter of history, therefore, does not belong to the building. It belongs to the observer, to how each generation decides what it carries forward as it moves on. Halcyon Hall offers no conclusions. It simply stands, for a moment longer than a human lifetime, as a reminder that every dream has an expiration date, and that it is precisely this impermanence that gives history its meaning. When we step away from Halcyon Hall and look outward, the story no longer feels singular. It reveals itself as a pattern, a recurring cycle in the history of societies that reach a level of wealth that's great enough to begin dreaming of permanence. In every era, people attempt to convert economic success into lasting significance. When political power feels uncertain, architecture becomes its language. When time has not yet produced tradition, form is used to simulate depth. And when anxiety about impermanence sets in, societies build larger, heavier, and more solemn structures, hoping weight alone will secure meaning. Yet this cycle almost always ends the same way, not in dramatic destruction, but in a quiet shift of priorities. As values change, symbols once placed at the center of public life are slowly pushed to the margins. They are not hated. They are simply no longer understood as they once were. And in history, being misunderstood often proves more dangerous than being openly opposed. Halcyon Hall is merely one expression of this cycle, unfolding within the context of the United States at the turn of the 20th century. But the same logic has appeared elsewhere across Europe after the Industrial Revolution, within ancient empires as power transferred hands, and in every society where wealth moves faster than meaning. The forms differ. The mechanism does not. What is striking is how rarely societies recognize this pattern while they are living through it. Only after a dream has dissolved do people begin to name it as a dream. Before that, it is treated as inevitability, as the future, as an order presumed to endure, And that certainty is what makes its eventual fading feel so quiet, so absolute. The remainder of history does not reside in the buildings that lose their purpose. It resides in how later generations interpret that loss. Whether they see it as failure or as an unavoidable stage of social maturity. Whether they attempt to recreate the old forms or accept that each era must invent its own symbolic language. At this point, Halcyon Hall withdraws from the center of the story. It steps aside and leaves the final question with the viewer. Not what happened to an estate, but what is happening to the dreams being built today. Which symbols of the present will become the Halcyon Halls of the future, and whether we can recognize them while we are still living inside them. History does not issue loud warnings. It repeats itself, quietly, in altered forms. Those who look back at stories like Halcyon Hall, not to indulge nostalgia, but to identify patterns, may begin to see their own present with greater clarity. Not to avoid every mistake, but to understand that no symbol can outlast time unless it changes alongside it. Here, the story truly comes to rest. Not with a conclusion, but with an intentional pause. A space where history hands the work of reflection back to the audience. And within that space, Halcyon Hall, along with every dream once built on absolute belief, settles quietly into a cycle far larger than any single generation. Not every structure is built to last forever. And not every dream is meant to outlive time. Some exist only to prove that, once, people believed in them completely. Halcyon Hall did not fall in fire or noise. It faded quietly, much like ideas that once felt unshakable, but gradually lost clarity as the world moved on. There was no decisive moment, only the steady force of the present, strong enough to push the past aside. Looking back, what remains is neither architecture nor ambition. What remains is a simple truth: power cannot be preserved through form, and history does not stay fixed inside what people attempt to hold in place. It lives in motion, and so, the story does not end with Halcyon Hall. It ends with the act of leaving it behind. Stepping back into the present, carrying a quiet understanding that every symbol must eventually face time on its own terms. The image fades. There is no more narration. Only time.